to stand outside the journalism union and to shout, Yasqut, Yasqut, Hosni Mubarak. It was such a thrill to say that. And I remember at the time that many Egyptians would look at us as if we were absolutely insane. Because the largest demonstration that I took part in 2005 was the one that coincided with the presidential election, which many of you know, I'm sure, was the first time since Mubarak took over that multiple candidates could run for president in Egypt. So Ayman Noor was contesting this presidency, and I think 8 other candidates that nobody knew anything about and everybody understood were just there to fill numbers. So it was basically Hosni Mubarak versus Ayman Noor. And the day before, or just a few days before, Ayman Noor held this huge rally in front of the Mugamma to encourage his supporters to vote. And I had never attended anything like that in Egypt before, where someone not affiliated with the NDP, someone not affiliated with the regime, held an event so openly and publicly. And then on the day of the presidential elections itself, I think it was maybe maximum 3,000, some people say maybe 4,000 people who marched from Tahrir to close to the journalism union against Hosni Mubarak. So it was 3,000. But during the normal demonstrations that we would have, that would start in Midan Talat Harb and then go to the journalism union again, the maximum that we would have on the street was maybe 150, 200, that was it. And as I said, we would be marching through the streets, in downtown Cairo. Egyptians were shopping, Egyptians were eating at restaurants, just walking up and down the squares. And they would look at us as if we were totally crazy. And we would ask them to join us, come and shout against Hosni Mubarak, because we knew nobody there liked Hosni Mubarak. But they were terrified. They could not imagine that you could march through the streets and shout, Yasqut, Yasqut, Hosni Mubarak, and survive. And so who are these crazy people? Who was this 150 people who were daring to say this? And it was absolutely understandable that they would not join us, because they knew that they would, A, disappear, be imprisoned and lose the 2 or 3 jobs that they had just to feed their families. And they understood that Amn al-Dawla and the riot police, they were not angels and they were certainly not going to treat them well. So why should they risk everything and march with these crazy people, 150? And then my family went to visit one of my aunts, my dad's sister. And my dad's family has a revolutionary history, because my grandfather, Allah yarhamu, marched against the British and spent a night in jail during the demonstrations against occupation. And my aunt marched after Gamal Abdel Nasser and the army officers staged their coup and Egyptians joined them in the streets. So we were having this great discussion about what was happening, and I was telling them how excited I was and why it was important for me to go back to Egypt and why it was such a thrill to march and shout, Yasqut, Yasqut, Hosni Mubarak. And there was an Egyptian man visiting. He wasn't a relative. He was a friend of my aunt's family, and he was, I think, in his 50s, maybe in his 60s, and he looked at me very skeptically and he said, what do you guys think you're going to do, 150 of you marching through the streets? Do you think you're going to do anything? Do you think the Americans will let you do anything? And I remember that, because I said to him, what the hell does this have to do with the Americans? He said, you think they're going to let you do anything to Hosni Mubarak? And he said, do you think Hosni Mubarak, who has the riot police and Amn al-Dawla and all of this, you think you're going to do anything to Hosni Mubarak? And I was so excited and I was so passionate about what was happening. I said to him, who cares about the Americans? Egyptian people will show them that we can bring about change. Who cares about Hosni Mubarak? If we get enough people on the street and help them overcome that fear, we can do something in this country. And he didn't buy any of it. And in the end, he just said to me, you know what? And I always say this sentence in Arabic, and then I'll translate it into English for those who don't speak Arabic, because the Arabic is just ridiculous. He said to me, you know what? هم بس الناس اللي شعرهم منعكش زيك اللي فاكرين حاجة هتحصل. So basically, he said to me, it's just people like you who have messy hair, the funky, crazy kids, who think, and I'm not even a kid. Back then I was, I think, 2005, so 6 years ago, 37. So I was so upset that not only was he so cynical, but that he just dismissed it as a bunch of crazy kids with funky hair or messy hair or anarchish hair, that I got up and I walked out. And my parents and my sister followed me. And the next day my aunt called me and she said, Mona, I'm so sorry. This man is terrible, an NDP supporter. And I couldn't believe I was so close to an NDP supporter. I should have thrown him over the balcony. But anyway, she said, I believe in what you're doing. It's amazing. And once I understood that so many of my relatives in Egypt, I left Egypt 10.5 years ago, had heard of these demonstrations, and not just through me, but because they were turning on satellite channels where people from Kifaya were speaking about what was happening, where especially, and I mentioned women and what was happening to Egypt, women were going on these satellite channels and talking not just about their participation in the protests, but what was happening to them, because soon after I moved back to Egypt in 2005, most of my relatives were really upset about the sexual harassment of women and the targeting of women in these protests especially. And that really was a big turning point for people. They couldn't believe that the regime had stooped so low that it would do this to women in Egypt. So the fact that my relatives, who were doctors and engineers and accountants and homemakers and, of all the different backgrounds you could imagine, who had not, since the days of my aunt and Nasser's days, had not been very political. They were just kind of ordinary Egyptians working, making a living. The fact that they were paying attention now to what was going on at a time when Al Ahram would only talk about the demonstrations because they caused a traffic jam. And so you would be able to buy Al Ahram newspaper, and this happened during the parliamentary elections, soon after the presidential elections. I would buy Al Ahram newspaper and Al Masr al-Yawm and Al Dastur and just compare the front pages. And you would feel that you were in two different countries. Because according to Al Ahram, the parliamentary elections were a beacon of democracy. A new age has overwhelmed Egypt, and we're seeing progress in the political arena that is unprecedented. And the front page of Al Masr al-Yawm was Egyptians who had put a ladder on the back of a police station, middle-aged Egyptian housewives basically, to climb up this ladder so that they could go to vote, because at the front of the police station was the riot police with their AK-47s shooting at people who dared to vote. And the headline would be, is this Gaza, is this Baghdad, or is this Cairo? So you were seeing the schism already happening in Egypt, where you could buy one newspaper that was giving you the lies, but you could buy newspapers that were telling you that something was changing in the country. Now, that movement at the time, of course, was quashed by Mubarak, because who joined that movement, among the many groups that were a part of it, were the judges, the great honorable judges in Egypt who wanted to be independent and who demanded the ability to oversee the elections. And I mention all of this because these are all things that are coming back now that we need to pay attention to in Egypt. And one of the most well-known figures at the time was Hisham al-Bastawisi, who belonged to the Judges Club and who was on television all the time talking about how important it was for judges to be independent so they could monitor these elections. And another election figure, or a judicial figure who became famous at the time, was a woman called Noha Zini. Now, Hisham al-Bastawisi comes from a more kind of leftist background, socialist leftist background, and Noha Zini was a young woman who, at the time, people accused of having Muslim Brotherhood affiliations, but she's recognized as being more conservative. But he was this female judge who was overseeing elections where Mustafa al-Fai, with the NDP, was running against a Muslim Brotherhood candidate who was known to be very popular. I can't remember the exact name of the constituency, but everybody anticipated the Muslim Brotherhood candidate would win because he was so popular in his constituency. And as many of you know, the three stages of the parliamentary elections in 2005 got progressively worse. The first stage was medium violence, the second stage was unleash more violence, the third stage was deadly, and several people lost their lives. And what Noha Zini did, and this again speaks to the importance of the judges and their independence and how we need that as we look ahead to how to truly free Egypt. She did something that we're all very familiar with here in the United States, which is called whistleblowing. But usually here in the US and in most countries, when you whistleblow anonymously. But she was a whistleblower who very much wanted to identify herself. And she sent to Al Masr al-Yawm a letter that she wrote detailing how, as she was counting through the ballot boxes, she saw the NDP supporters basically tip all the votes for the Muslim Brotherhood candidate into the box for Mustafa al-Fai, so that they could basically just completely reverse the vote and make Mustafa al-Fai win. And the Muslim Brotherhood published her letter in complete, with her signature in it, and that edition of, not the Muslim Brotherhood, sorry, Masr al-Yawm, and that edition of Masr al-Yawm was sold out. And it was the first time that this Masr al-Yawm sold out, and they had to reprint it again the next day. So there again was an indication of how Egyptians were speaking out in unprecedented ways, risking their names and risking their lives, and very soon after they paid a price for it. Because at the beginning